Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, wherever you are. My name is Laura Davis. I'm from the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office, which is an independent civil society platform of European NGOs, networks of NGOs and think tanks working to build peace and prevent violent conflict worldwide. And I'm very happy to welcome you on behalf of both EPLO and of our partner Adelphi to this workshop called Building Community Resilience to Climate Change and Conflict, Lessons from the Pacific. This is the second workshop in an online series called Climate Change and Human Security, Integrating Peacebuilding and Climate Adaptation Efforts in Practice. And this is organized together with our partners Adelphi and the Climate Diplomacy Initiative and with support from the German Federal Foreign Office. And the first three workshops in the series are organized as part of the Berlin Climate and Security Conference. Okay. So a couple of small practical matters about our meeting before we launch into it. For your information, this workshop is being recorded as we've been asked to make it available, and it will go online, and you will be notified of this at some point after the workshop. We will start with interventions by our speakers and our respondent, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, before opening the floor to the audience for an interactive discussion. Now, although we are dispersed very far and wide and we are meeting virtually, we would like to keep this as human as possible. So we ask you that in order to join in the interactive session, please use the dedicated Q&A, question and answer box at the bottom of the window, and type in your question. Now, what we would like to do, if you agree, is that then we will ask you to put your question so that we have people speaking to people, not computers speaking to people. However, if you have a poor connection or you do not wish to ask your question for whatever reason, please just put this in the Q&A box and then I can read it out for you. Now, just so that you're aware, only the cameras of the panelists will turn on. So we will, if you wish to ask a question or make a comment, we will turn on your microphone, but your webcam will stay disconnected for the whole duration of the workshop. If anything is unclear, please contact my colleague Lorenzo Angelini, also from EPLO, whose email address is appearing in the chat box. So, now that we have the practical stuff out of the way, let's dive into our panel. I'm very honoured to introduce Coral Persisi, who is the Senior Advisor to the Director General of the Pacific Community. She has over 20 years experience in the Pacific Islands region, focusing on sustainable development, climate change and associated financing. She recently briefed the UN Security Council on climate security challenges in the region. Kate Higgins is the Pacific Projects Manager for Conciliation Resources and works on supporting Pacific Islander peacebuilding actors to develop contextually relevant peacebuilding knowledge and practice. She has been working in the region for over a decade with community-based organizations, churches, civil society, and government. And our respondent is Kevin Petrini, the Deputy Resident Representative for the UN Development Programme Pacific Office in Fiji. He has been involved in international development work related to the environment, climate change, disaster risk management and community mobilization in the Pacific for over 18 years. So I'm delighted to welcome the three of you. Each will give a short kickoff for our discussion, and then we will be coming back to each of the panelists during the session that follows. So Coral, without any more from me, I would like to turn over to you, and the floor is yours.
Try and figure out now. Can you see the screen and can you hear me? Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you, and my learned colleagues have joined as well, and just to help raise some of the awareness around these challenges in the Pacific region, and to share some of those lessons and hear also from the audience about ideas on how we can address this very significant challenge. Now let me just make sure that I'm able to operate. All right. So I just wanted to first give you a little bit of perspective and context about what we're talking about in the Pacific. So this map is of the blue Pacific continent. So we have 22 countries and territories that make up this massive area of ocean and the Earth's surface. With 12 million people, 28 million square kilometers of ocean, and only 2% of that is land. This equates to 20% of the total world's EEZ space. So it is a very significant part of the territory of the entire globe. The vast majority of most, if not all, Pacific populations are indigenous. So both collectively and individually, our economies, our environments, people, and security are intricately linked to the ocean and the certainty around which we can sustainably manage and benefit from the resources of that ocean now and into the future. And the state of our blue continent is also critical and underpins the health and well-being of the whole planet. So this is a graph that shows the distance of populations from the coasts around the Pacific. So you'll see that around 60% of all the Pacific Island countries the populations live within 1 kilometer of the coast. If we took out Papua New Guinea, it's close to 90 to 100% of those populations. We also have the most lowest lying atoll nations in the world, 4. And while all Pacific Island countries and small island developing states face massive challenges with climate change, those are extremely vulnerable and face a whole number of additional security challenges that we should be conscious about. Now, I won't go into this in detail, but I had worked last year together with adelphi and the Federal Foreign Office to support the discussions around climate security and the challenges being faced by different regions around the world to help inform the UN Security Council. And so we looked at what do these look like in the Pacific. So there's many different issues, but if we were to distill 5, these are the 5 that we landed on being the big issues facing the region, and they cause fragility that could lead to undermining communities, countries' economies, destabilizing them, and ultimately leading to conflict. So this is, I'm going to go into the ones covered in yellow, in displacement, security, and the human food and water security and human security in that context. But I'm happy to follow up with others on some of the other issues around maritime zone boundary, stability, and other implications on the blue economy. So let's just move into some of the key issues around food and water insecurity. So we have a very short period of time. I couldn't possibly do justice to the range of issues in here, but because we are so intricately linked to the ocean, I'm going to pick specifically on the impacts we have in the coastal area and our dependency on coastal food sources. So we know that within 10 years, which is a very short period of time, we could possibly reach 90% loss in coral reef systems. And this underpins a whole 1/4 of life in the ocean. And as you will be aware, Pacific populations are heavily reliant on those coastal fisheries, which are degrading at rates that we can't keep up with. So families who would normally feed their children for 5 days a week for free off that healthy protein source are facing a situation where they have to replace that very quickly, and they have to learn the skill sets that are surrounded around that alternative food source. Water resources are scarce, and particularly on the lowest lying atoll nations, we have seawater intrusion amongst a number of other things. We have new invasive species and pests that our Indigenous people and communities are not used to dealing with, and don't have the systems in place to deal with those either. And we are looking at replacing, supplementing food sources that don't come from these regions, and therefore the cultures and traditions used to deal with those, run the risk of being lost. So some of the lessons that we've learned in this space is you can't simply supplement a chicken for a fish. Fishing is a part of our culture, that those traditions and secrets are handed down by thousands of years of tradition and history. And there's great arts around this, and communities are held together by seasonal fishing, by collectively knowing when to go out and put conservation areas in place, so that it's far more than just a food source. Another key lesson that we've learned is that community aspirations are critical to understand and drive intervention. We can't simply look at this as a food replacement issue or we'll move people from here. We have to have conversations and build relationships with those communities to really understand and appreciate what it is that they actually want and what for them is development. Because our perceptions of development, and we can see globally, obviously there are very, very different measures of success in that space. Another really critical, and probably for me the most critical, I'm a scientist by background, but I've was born, lived and raised in the Pacific. So for me, the traditional knowledge and culture is still far more informative about the reality than the science that we have in the Pacific. And if you looked at the history of the science that we have in our databases that allow us to make integrated decision making, there are gaps everywhere, particularly when we look back at history and particularly in our countries in the region. But we have still with us, people who've been around for 80 years who have had their eyes on the water and seen the changes of those ecosystems and those dependent resources. We know this, that we hear the stories of where wave inundation came up to for the, over the last 60 years of different cyclone categories. So that knowledge is absolutely invaluable, and it's not captured and used in the decision-making systems around investment in adaptation and resilience building, and it should be. We need to give that credibility, and we have to do it sooner rather than later. And any investment, we've had a history of bad investment in the development discourse. Short project-based implementation doesn't work well in big countries, and it's about 50 times worse in small countries. We stop, start, and it's not sustainable, and it actually becomes more draining as more partners want to come in and support with little bits of project money and things. We can't do that anymore. If we really want to make gains, we have to create investment arrangements that are suitable to the commensurate absorptive capacity of communities and countries in the Pacific. So moving then to displacement and forced migration. This is already happening in the Pacific. People will say it's not, and there's probably development issues. There may be some bad planning going on in some places, but the truth is it is already happening. It has been happening for a while. We're just not documenting it well enough. Fiji and Vanuatu have done some really good assessments with the support of partners as well, and developed their own relocation policies. And this is really important. And they've looked at a range of different impacts from climate change to inform that. So there's some formal approaches that are being looked at, and then there's sort of informal, traditional gentlemen's agreements being implemented as well in this space. A good example for me is the Tuvaluan community that have migrated to Niue because of the issue of climate change, and our leader and their leader spoke and agreed about this about 15 years ago. So they have a different, they don't have to meet the same immigration requirements as others. And this is a cultural approach to the solution. It's not documented or tracked. I only know about it because I've lived here pretty much my whole life, and my children go to school with young Tuvaluan kids who come and talk about their family having moved here because of climate change, talking about their culture and stuff. So this is such a wealth of practice that we haven't yet captured and documented for more people to know about. Some of the lessons: conflict over scarce land in the Pacific is going to be a real problem. It already is in just normal development challenges. It is definitely going to create conflict, and we can't deal with that with just Western systems of courts and laws. We actually have to have entrenched cultural and traditional approaches to deal with this, and we need to work with partners who are embedded in the communities and in these countries, and who have trusted relationships. So the traditional and cultural governance systems in communities in the Pacific is critical in this space, as are institutions like the church, who have been there right from the beginning, and who are not project-based in their existence. They are part of the community, so that's a really important thing. We are looking at reclamation, seawalls, sandbanks, ecosystems-based adaptation arrangements to strengthen the coastlines. But we have to know that there's only so much you can adapt to. We are going to lose land, and we are going to lose culture, and we have to be honest about that and document it, because it's an inherent right to our children. So even if we can't do everything that we want to, we need to be able to capture that for them, so they understand what it was at certain spaces in time. And there are a range of other ways that we need to give government certainty around the finances to deal with some of these more expensive challenges around infrastructure and relocation of communities. Who pays for the hospital, creates jobs, all of those things that make people who are moved away from their homes feel like they are still important contributors to the society. So just in concluding, without a doubt, we have to have greater ambition. If we don't, we're going to suffer so much more loss than we could possibly deal with. So that is still our number one priority. We have to let people who are affected define what security means. It shouldn't be an academic exercise. We shouldn't make it too academic. We need to have conversations with them and let their stories shape what their insecurity is. We need to develop sustainable financing mechanisms, and they should be able to be informed by traditional and cultural knowledge, not just science. We couldn't possibly have sufficient science to invest money to be absolutely sure, and we can only add value to that by formalizing traditional knowledge in decision-making systems and in project development. We absolutely need to work on legal protection arrangements for people who are displaced by climate change. There is no protection at the moment, so whilst cultural systems work within the Pacific, if people have to move outside of that, they really need the certainty, because unlike other conventions that protect people who move from country, there's nowhere to go back to. They can't be sent back if they were to get into trouble and break the law or something. There isn't that option, so it needs to be tailor-made. And we have to document loss and damage. It is a real challenge. We are already losing things. Our country went through one of the biggest Category 5 cyclones in history in the Pacific. We lost our whole museum. That's 95% of our cultural heritage. That's irreplaceable. And we need to incentivize ecosystems-based adaptation. So a great travesty and injustice in the Pacific is we were never recognized as being able to participate in the carbon markets to encourage, reduction in pollution in the air that's causing climate change. We're considered too small. We can't make big enough contribution there. But we certainly can contribute to ocean protection. We have the biggest blue continent capacity to do that. There's no market incentive to do that. There's no mechanism that rewards countries that lock up huge amounts of their ocean resources. And if we can create a market to support that, so a conservation unit is worth something, whether it's in debt swaps for nature or whether it's in credit swaps for continued resilience building, then we start to really help to balance what is currently a really unjust system, where the countries that are most affected are least able to resource that, and yet we still traditionally feel responsibility to lock up big parts of our ocean resource because that's part of our future as much as it is yours. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and look forward to hearing other presentations and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Coral. And now, Kate, I'll move straight over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and thank you to the organisers for this important session. This session is important because in the Pacific region, we are witnessing a great need to integrate peace-building approaches into the ways in which we are addressing the impacts of climate and environmental change. And I'd really like to thank Carol for her, her wonderful presentation, and I hope that mine will pick up on some of the points that she's made, particularly around community aspirations being crucial to intervention, how critical Indigenous governance mechanisms are in terms of preventing conflict, and allowing people to define their own insecurity as part of that. Those are things that I hope that I'll be able to touch on today. So I work for Conciliation Resources, which is an international peacebuilding organisation committed to preventing and responding to violent conflict. Peacebuilding and the environment is a new area of policy and practice for Conciliation Resources. In our Pacific program, we are addressing the challenge of how to prevent conflict in a way that works with community worldviews and community agency. We work in the Melanesian region, so a quite defined area, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands and Fiji, where we see that environmental change is rapidly occurring due to a range of factors including resource mismanagement, population growth and climate change impacts. Our program is developing community up practice, which enables people to analyse and plan their own futures and incorporate peace-building approaches which build relationships, including with external actors, to facilitate conflict prevention actions. This approach recognises that for much of the Pacific, society is organised by local Indigenous leadership structures, including a significant role played by churches, and that land and resource management is rooted in practices embedded in collective and spiritual worlds. I'd also like to acknowledge that our work is in partnership with national civil society partners, and in Fiji that includes Transcend Oceania and the Pacific Centre for Peacebuilding, and also with the Toda Peace Institute, who, if you go to their website, you can find a range of really interesting policy papers on climate change and conflict in Oceania. So before I touch very briefly on our program, I'd like to talk about 4 key conflict risks we are seeing emerge in the Melanesian region of the Pacific. So the first is violent conflict arising in the wake of natural disasters. We know that natural disasters are increasing in severity, and in the last decade we have witnessed the ferociousness of cyclones of Winston in Fiji, Pam in Vanuatu. And this year, Harold hit at the same time as the outbreak of COVID-19, creating new logistical challenges for responding. Militaries and other state security forces are increasingly being employed in the response to natural disasters, yet security forces themselves can be a source of insecurity for many communities, as we have seen in Fiji, Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. The effects of natural disasters, including the responses such as humanitarian aid, can unearth existing conflicts, and we saw this in the case of the 2014 riots in Honiara, which is the capital of Solomon Islands, after massive flooding hit the capital. The second conflict risk is the impact of climate change on resources, and this is something that Carol really picked up in her presentation, or Coral, sorry. This is very much in line with current international understandings of climate change as exacerbating conflict. The key context in the Pacific, as I pointed out at the beginning, is that the majority of resources in the Pacific are managed by small land ownership groupings, and often conflict is centred around the management and distribution of land and resources within kinship, but also between kinship groups. Land and these resources is governed by these communities with little regulation by the state or state institutions, and often when the state does intervene, it in itself becomes a driver of conflict. A bridge to my third risk I'd like to point out is a dynamic that notes that the Pacific has long histories of internal migration. And today there are, Coral pointed this out with the example of Vanuatu about adopting families. I find that really interesting. There's many informal arrangements that take place. And some of these arrangements date back to well over 100 years. And there are many factors that influence the peaceful negotiation over land and resources, and we can learn a lot from these histories and the local governance norms which have emerged, which remake peaceful community. So it's not all bad news. The third conflict risk is climate change related displacement and relocation. And this is what Conciliation Resources and our partners is particularly focused on at present. It can consist of informal relocation agreements. It can be formal relocation processes supported by external actors, as we are seeing with the relocation of rural villages in Fiji due to sea level rise. But also we have to point out the forms of informal climate mobility, such as increased urbanisation with it an increased need to focus on urban peace and security issues. But this does not mean that the courts and the police take over. Cultures and identities and traditions which maintain peaceful relations also travel from rural to urban areas. And finally, this is one we have a question mark around. It's a question. Could climate change intervention also be something that exacerbates conflict? Could disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation and relocation programs interact with existing conflict systems? As we've seen in the case of Solomon Islands, humanitarian aid after disasters, and with the many development projects which have failed because of lack of community consultation, not really understanding what communities want and need. And also creating new forms of inclusion and exclusion, those who benefit and those who don't. This has not only led to significant aid failure, but has exacerbated existing conflict systems. Therefore, we believe we need to develop practice that goes beyond conflict sensitivity and do no harm approaches, which is an amazing and great place to start, to engage with the existing governance arrangements and conflict systems in communities in order to build in conflict prevention measures as part of adaptation to climate change to make sure that these interventions are successful. And I think developing practice in this area is more of a medium-term ambition of Conciliation Resources. So just to touch briefly on our emerging program of work with our partners, we've been developing an adaptive peacebuilding methodology which works with community leaders and members at various stages of an iterative cycle. These stages are not always linear. For example, number 6, learning and advocacy and dialogue at scale is something that I'm participating in at this very moment. I won't go into too much detail here, but the first stage is really that relationship building. And for example, in Fiji, it might be called Sevu Sevu. It's really essential to make sure that we're doing, finding out what community aspirations are. Based on this, building in action research into research and inquiry stage, and mapping relationships and strategic relationships which can build peace. The third phase is sense making and dialogue of this research, which is not done by us here I'm in Australia or even in Suva or a capital, but taken back to communities and used as a form of dialogue to make sense, and maybe to make sense of some of those perspectives that the chief might not hear. Might be a young woman speaking, for example, and coming up with a collective story and really throwing out all the complexity onto the table. And from that, community-led peace-building actions, which might be integrating with existing climate change adaptation work. And we have some examples of that emerging at present, which you can ask me about more. Building in M&E, reflection and learning, understanding it from a subject-orientated position. And then, of course, because this is actually the relationships and time that you need to put into these processes, there's so much that conciliation resources and partners can do. So capturing the learning, the advocacy and comparative learning so that we can talk to other people working in these areas. So in conclusion, when viewed from the national level, the region is often labelled as aid dependent and fragile, but this misses the opportunity which lies in the fact that much social and political order is governed within small scales. Change is happening, but it is not linear. There are populations who will have to move, but people are adaptable, and the identities which are fundamental to building peace travel from one place to another. And how do we support that? Pacific Island peoples, from my limited, I guess, interaction, are speaking out against being victims of a global crisis. When we use narratives of climate security, we can invoke a sense of crisis, and this may be necessary, and it is necessary in terms of the advocacy around reducing emissions. But we must not let this discourse lead to short-term, time-bound, and the micro little projects of everyone trying to help at the same time, as Coral pointed out. The primary investment needed is working with communities is time. And thank you, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Kate. So I'm just about to turn over to Kevin, but just before I do, I would like to remind us all that after Kevin has spoken, we will go to a discussion. So please do start putting your questions in the queue, or questions and comments in the Q&A box, and so that we can dive straight into that once Kevin has spoken. But for now, let's turn to Kevin. Kevin, over to you. Kevin? Okay, so we appear to have lost Kevin. So we'll try and get him back. I know that he was not joining us from his expected location, so he had already made an extra effort to get a good connection, but that seems to have fallen by the wayside. So we will come back to Kevin, and I'm going to turn over to the Q&A box. I must say, actually, the first comment is from Crisis Management Initiative. I believe that's the CMI that we're talking about, who noted, Coral, the correlations between some of the resonances of what you were talking about with events in the sub-Saharan region with desertification. And I must say, as someone who's spent a lot of time in that region of the world, that resonated very strongly with me as well. I'd like to turn over to Lorenzo Conti to put his, so please do feel free, if you would like, either of you to comment on correlations with desertification, but also not to. There's no need to respond unless you wish to. So Lorenzo Conti, would you like to put your question? We'll turn your microphone on, but your camera will remain off.
Yes, thank you very much, and also thank you for the two very interesting presentations. Yeah, I just wanted to ask whether you had any recommendation for international actors who are looking to engage and support young women and men in particular to build peace and adapt to climate change. Thank you.
Great. So let's go back to you both. So Coral, can I turn to you? And then, oh, actually, sorry, I'm going too quickly because the questions are all flooding in. Let's take a couple of questions. So I have Stefania Minervino from the European Commission. Stefania, would you like to put your question? Your microphone is on. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so sorry, apologies, I didn't hear the presentation from the beginning. So my question maybe had an answer earlier. I was just wondering, as a great majority of Pacific Islanders and inhabitants are indigenous people, according to international definition, I was just wondering how the peace building, community work and climate change adaptation work includes processes of consultation for free, prior and informed consent, as mandated by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, because we also have a council conclusion communication which says that we should be doing we should be facilitating these human rights, which is specific to Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. And then a comment from Baruti Likoi. It is true. Baruti, would you like to make your comment? Baruti, you can go ahead. Hi, Baruti. You can go ahead with your comment. Okay, we seem to have problems with Baruti's connection. So Baruti's comment is that insecurity issues should indeed be defined by local communities themselves, but when Ms. BCSC requests legal protection for climate displaced people, she should recognize that academics and international community consider the displacement of people as a potential insecurity issues in the Pacific. So we will go back to the panel now and then come back to the questions. So we have two comments and two questions. So I'll start first with you, Coral, and then turn to Kate. Okay, thank you.
Sure, and thanks. Those are good questions. So let me start with the question around the consultation with Indigenous people in the Pacific, and noting, yes, that's correct. The vast majority of populations across the Pacific countries are Indigenous people. And so in that respect, they're very much ingrained. The consultation with Indigenous people is run mostly by Indigenous people, from government to subnational level to communities. And it's part of our everyday life. We still rely very heavily on the cycles of weather and climate to inform how we fish, how we harvest, how we prepare for impending natural disasters. We still all read those signs. I do that myself, and I am trained as a scientist, but I have lived and grown up my whole life in that scenario. So it's quite an organic process that Indigenous views and suggestions for how to deal with different things are factored into national policies for adaptation and resilience building, as well as community activities, and also in the real capacity to respond to these is also in those Indigenous communities. The governments in the Pacific are actually quite small and would never have the necessary capacity to deploy all of the necessary resilience building measures. So it's a very strong process. And a lot of our history and the way we do things is through oral means. We don't document stuff, we talk about things, we reach agreements in that manner. And this is where the disconnect, I think, between science-informed decision-making systems like GIS systems, policies that go up through the Western system of governance sometimes don't factor in and give the same level of formality to the traditional knowledge. And I'll give an example, right? So wave inundation modeling, we don't have anywhere near the historical data or satellite imagery available to tell us where have the waves reached in different cyclone categories over the last 40 years. But if you sat down with the community, the oldest people in the community would be able to pinpoint on a map where wave inundation came to. And so when do we give that the same credence and the same level of authority as we would to satellite imagery and Western system of science and modeling? Is it when 10 people say that they all did come to that spot? We haven't developed those I don't know what the word is, to benchmark and agree that would constitute enough information and viewpoints from Indigenous people to be considered a fact, just like science would. And we need to start doing that. So I think we have some room to work around that formalization of Indigenous knowledge and its formal integration into decision-making systems. And investment as well. So when you're developing a project proposal for climate finance, traditional knowledge and that kind of historical knowledge should help to inform the approval of projects, rather than just we have to have science. I know we have to do a year of modeling and testing because we haven't got the science, when we could go back and get enough historical knowledge to inform those investments with a high degree of certainty based on our own indigenous knowledge. So I think I'm sorry, I've actually forgotten what the second question was, but maybe I'll turn over to Kate while I just have a quick chat back through the Q&A. Thanks.
Well, I'll have a go at answering the first question around international actors looking to engage and support young women and men to build peace and adapt to the effects of climate change. I think what's really crucial, not just for peace building, not just for climate change adaptation, but any kind of intervention in the Pacific, the diversity of some of the locations that Coral was talking about, and some of the communities I've been referring to, you know, it's very, very different. So it's hard to generalize. But sometimes we tend to isolate categories of people, young women, young men, elders and leaders, but really what's really important is the relationship between different identities. So it might be about work, if you wanted to work with young women or young men, it might be about, well, what is their relationships within the communities? What are their roles? What are the aspirations for their roles? How would they want to contribute to the communities and to broader regions and to society and to the nation? And to the region, you know, what are those aspirations? And you'll most likely find it's about working on those relationships between people, not just isolating people out. I think we see quite a lot of gender work not being as effective as it could be because we're going, oh, get a group of women together, but we're treating them in isolation from the environment and the society within which they're located.
Thank you very much, Kate, and welcome back, Kevin. Thank you very much for making the extra effort to join us in the first place and then to rejoin us again. So in the meantime, Kate and Coral have answered a couple of the questions that came from the audience, but I would like very much now to turn to Kevin Petrini of UNDP to respond to our two opening presentations, and then I will recap on where we are with the questions, and we will go forward into the interactive discussion with Kevin, we hope. Anyway, over to you, Kevin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here this evening and morning and with everyone from around the world, and especially with my co-panelists. Those presentations really provided such a breadth and width of engagement points and issues that we're facing here in the Pacific, and really appreciate the setting of the scene. And of course, to our organizers, EPLO and Adelphi, really appreciate bringing together around this issue and the focus on the Pacific, which I believe here is, it's just so important for us to be looking at this, the issues of climate change, but not in silos, and looking at it through issues that are being affected beyond, you know, just standalone adaptation efforts, but integrating into community engagement and how that looks. Just quickly, this is a similar slide that Coral had here about the blue Pacific. And, you know, the Pacific Island leaders have, you know, coined this as the blue Pacific and big ocean state. And, you know, a picture like this really, you know, puts us in our place in terms of what are we really talking about here, and what is the context in which, when we're talking about the Pacific, what we mean. I also just wanted to point out that at the highest level, the UN Secretary General of the United Nations came here to the Pacific last year in 2019 and visited in Vanuatu, Fiji, and Tuvalu to really understand firsthand what was happening in terms of the climate crisis and what is happening. And through that, actually emerged out of that was a concept and an idea around what is climate security in the Pacific context. I think Coral pointed out on this earlier, is that, you know, we have to go beyond the theoretical, and we have to get to the point where we're actually listening to communities and their aspirations, and what is this issue of climate change, and what is it from a security lens. And actually working with Coral and others, we were able to pull together a project that will help do some initial work on that, particularly in the atoll states, and when working with Kiribati and Tuvalu and Republic of Marshall Islands, but also at the regional level, working with Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, which is really important to look at this from a regional perspective. I just also add in here a little bit about UNDP, and globally we have a Small Island Developing States offer, or SIDS offer. And in the Pacific, we're looking at 14 Pacific Island countries, but also around the world, we have 40 plus Small Island Developing States. And in that, we're really looking at three things: is climate action, the blue economy, and digitalization. And when I think of the discussions and what I heard from Kate and Coral earlier today, I really see how that offer actually touches on very much first two of climate action and of course, blue economy, but also the opportunity of digitalization. Maybe a bit ironic that I was cut off earlier in this call, so there is difficulty with the internet penetration around the Pacific, which is very real. But also there's opportunities there as well that we need to be looking at. And I think it actually can link right into our discussions around traditional knowledge, but with protecting it adequately, but also being able to share it where it's appropriate and how it can be appropriately shared. Digitization can also be a potential solution there. Part of the slides, you'll see right in the middle of this, there's a little red square there. And that is the island of the country of Tuvalu, and that's where it sits. And if you haven't heard of Tuvalu before, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to some of the issues faced there, and one project we're working on there with the Green Climate Fund. Before I zoom in on that, though, just to pick up on some points that I heard earlier, and I was a bit inspired by both Coral and Kate, in terms of some of the points they're making about traditional knowledge. And I had distinct privilege of having an audience with the Samoan head of state back in 2007, and he shared with me the indigenous view on the Samoan indigenous view of peace. And he has written about this extensively. He's still alive today, Tuiatua Tupua Tamasese, and is an amazing resource to the Pacific and of course to Samoa in terms of traditional knowledge. And he told me about the 4 harmonies that day. And I really think it still stands. I mean, it stands, of course it still stands, but it stands, I think, in the context of our conversation that we're having today, really apropos. The 4 harmonies, the first harmony that he says, and you need all 4 of these harmonies to exist to have peace. Without any one of them, you will not have peace. And that's the premise behind it. And the first harmony, that we need to have harmony with ourselves. So we have to have a relationship with ourselves that's at peace. After that, we have to have harmony with others. And we have to have harmonies, and that includes our community and the people we surround ourselves with, and having peace in that context. And then you have to have peace with the environment. The environment is around us. As Coral mentioned, it's been observed by the elders. They know the cycles, they know the changes, they know the different things that are happening. And so we have to have harmony with that. And a good example in the Pacific is, the word taboo comes from the Pacific. And that used to be where, you have fishing areas and you would not fish from them for some time in some countries. So you have these different, relationship with the environment and in harmony with that environment. And the 4th harmony is the harmony with the cosmos. And this is where the spiritual aspect comes in. And, regardless of your spiritual, what your religion may be, there is a connection with the cosmos, with God, with the spirit that also has to be in harmony. And if you have these 4 harmonies, then you're going to have peace. And that's how he conceptualized and had shared with me the idea of, what is peace in the indigenous Samoan context. And I thought that was really important to share in the context of our conversation. And then just to very quickly deep dive into Tuvalu and really talk about, I think, vulnerability. On the left-hand side of this slide, we have an atoll. And if you haven't seen an atoll before, I guess you get your first picture of it here. And it really is the rim of a volcano, an extinct volcano that is underwater, and the rim is just out of the water here. And so geologically, it's this very thin strip in this context of this atoll that looks like this on the left. And you look on the right, we zoom in, and you can see the main capital of Fongafale Island and the central built area there. And you can see the runway goes right through the main capital. There's not even a fence around the runway. When the plane comes in, the fire truck comes out and does the siren, so everybody will stand to the side of the runway, and then the plane can come in. And it's a pretty dramatic entrance with water on all sides of you. So this is the environment in which the capital of Tuvalu is based. And now, just looking at that, the images I'm giving now are based on some what's called LiDAR data. And LiDAR basically is able to give the topographical resolution of the island and the near shore marine environment within a few centimeters in any spot. And through the project we're working on there, we were able to map the entire country. It's good for climate change work, but it's just as good for any development work as well. And so this LiDAR information is now superimposed on the map, and you have the shoreline. But what you have now is twice a month, which is during the spring tide, so that's the new moon and the full moon, you get higher than, at the highest of the high tides of the month. And if you take the average spring tide in Tuvalu and Fongafale, it covers about 40% of the island. So we talk about climate change in the future. Well, no, it's happening now. We've already had sea level rise. We're having more sea level rise, and it's coming up through the island. And people sometimes say, let's protect the coast. Well, in this case, you could put a seawall there, but it's coming up through. And so on a clear day in Tuvalu, on a spring tide, you can be walking through ankle deep water in front of the main electricity generation plant in Tuvalu. So you can just get a feel for what this vulnerability is. This next slide, just to again show you some of the data. These are the points of Tuvalu that are above 1 meter. So if you actually, the green is, and so although there'll be massive change in the topography of Fongafale over the years from different factors and cyclones and other events, if we simply took Fongafale today and added 1 meter of sea level rise, which is projected to happen by 2100, these are the bits and pieces of land that are above that. So you can see the sheer vulnerability we're dealing with here. And then in the project that we're working on here is actually looking at, it's with the Green Climate Fund, where we're looking at vertical adaptation. So we're actually looking at a solution where we're going to raise up the land in certain places in order to have safe, planned relocation to some extent, because there'll be some movement to this new land that would be created. So again, just to give you some feel for what Tuvalu is suffering from at this very moment. Just some key lessons on this, I think, overall, that I'd like to share. The multi-stakeholder inclusive approach. I think this is also mentioned by my colleagues about having to work with different partners, but also at different levels. And this is really critical and underpins real success. And very much mentioned by Coral and Kate as well, is about local knowledge and scientific data. And it was interesting, when I shared my presentation with the Director of Climate Change before I gave this presentation today, she said, Kevin, this LiDAR has been great, but really it's saying what the elders have been telling us all along. And so it's great that we have now both worlds coming together in order to have a narrative that reinforces and can convince probably some about some of the issues that are being faced with this scientific data. And I can't understate how important that aspect of connecting those two dots is. The third point, institutionalization and capacity of key planning processes. I guess what I want to communicate here is that one-off projects, as Coral mentioned, are not the solution. We need planning, programs, larger scale thinking, and future vision in order to understand where things are going, and that will really drive the investments. The fourth point here on community ownership and including vulnerable groups, I think, again, was mentioned quite extensively by Coral and Kate, and it's absolutely critical. You know, you don't want to build a seawall and not talk to the fisher folk, and then they can't get their canoes into the ocean when they're, you know, once this nice new seawall's up in there. Finally, the need for sustainable forms of financing. So this is where I think the real challenge is, and it links to the third point about institutionalization and key planning, is that we do need really a strategic vision about what, helping support the aspirations that are embedded and enshrined in national development strategies and plans, and then finding mechanisms and ways to support that in a sustainable manner, considering the uniqueness of the economies of the variety of the Pacific Island countries. So again, thank you very much for this opportunity to present a bit here, reflect upon the two initial presentations, and looking forward to further discussion. Over.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. Thank you for joining us back. So we now turn to the questions that we have. Now, there are a couple of questions specifically for Coral. I'd like to turn first to Tessa Terpstra from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. If you would like to put your question, Tessa, and then I will group a couple of the others. Tessa, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks for the fascinating presentations. I'm more well known with the Middle East, and I'm really fascinated to hear all this. My question was to Coral about local community engagement, and whether you feel that their voice is being heard and they're being represented enough in international fora talking about climate change adaptation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tessa. So before turning over to you, Coral, for that, we also have a question from Moira. Thank you to all the presenters. To Coral, looking at the Tuvalu and Niue agreement, how do those communities that must relocate physically settle into their new homes? Do they cluster into their own cultural groups or integrated into established community? What impact, if any, do these settlement patterns have on local power dynamics and dialogues in climate adaptation? And if I may, I would also like to fold into that an element of the question from Margot from EPLO, which is if in the context of this particular agreement, what made it successful and what could have been done better perhaps in retrospect. So Coral, if you would like to take those two questions, and then of course I will turn to Kate and Kevin if you have anything particular to add, but I would also like to draw attention to Stefania's question, which perhaps links to Tessa's before, which is around the extent to which peacebuilding and climate change work include processes of consultation for free, prior and informed consent as prescribed by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Okay, so that's a lot to get going with. So Coral, over to you.
Thank you very much. Again, really good questions. So I'll take first the question in respect to whether Indigenous, from Tessa, whether international fora are hearing the voices of local communities and Indigenous people. That's a tough question. I think you need to ask the people that should be listening to our leaders when they go. All of our leaders are Indigenous people. They go to the COPs every year with impassioned pleas about the impacts of climate change, and we still haven't seen sufficient action in commitments. And so to some degree, I think people are hearing it, but I think, again, it comes back to, whether governments are bold enough to take the stances necessary to curb the emissions. That's a big challenge. And I think, the voices that are missing from those negotiations in the international arena are the business sector. They drive, they have a huge power and responsibility, and I don't think there is sufficient engagement with them in this space. And also, even where there's positive steps, I think Europe has been very progressive in the policies that it's putting in place to create an environment of certainty for investors in technology that will address some of the big challenges around bringing the emissions reductions down. And we need big companies now to start talking about that's actually that makes economic sense just as it does environmental sense, because I think people are sick of hearing the government discussions. They're taking too long, to be honest. I think it's very hard to take Indigenous communities in our countries and put them into the international arena, certainly not the climate change one, where they would feel like they knew how that worked. I mean, I struggle still how that works, and I've been focusing on this for over 20 years. So I wish that we had more ability to go in country, capture that on video, and in ways that help to tell the real story of what's happening, so that we don't just hear the big gloom and doom on the science projections and stuff, but you actually hear from people, hear from the mother who is currently feeding her children for free for 5 days a week out of 7, and doesn't know how she's going to do that when that resource can no longer sustain that. So I think we need to start projecting those stories, because they put a human face to the actual issue. So just to go to Moira's question, yeah, I think this is actually a really amazing case, and I just take it for granted, as most Indigenous people in the Pacific do. We just have lived this lifestyle, so we don't find it, particularly amazing or anything. It's just normal. But when I look at this now, when I look back on this is actually one of the case studies that we do need to document and share. And this happened about 15 years ago in the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meeting, when the Pacific leaders at the time were really trying to drive the message of being scared. It's not if, but when our people will have to move, and we want them to be able to move and assimilate into other societies with confidence, not as refugees, not looked on negatively. So they were looking at trying to get access to larger countries' markets for labor, for education, so that they can start equipping their people to have the choice to move with dignity if they needed that. Our country is probably an anomaly in the Pacific. We are probably the only one with the population declining and not increasing. So our leader at the time has just said, look, we need people. We don't have enough people to do the work in country, and we've got plenty of land, and our island is a high island. We're a coral island that's a raised atoll. So, if your people need work and they're scared of losing their homes because of climate change, we'll accept them. And because of that discussion in a leaders forum, that was the gentleman's agreement that established a practice of Tuvaluan people coming into Niue because of climate change. They wanted to get away from the areas that they were in. They were under a lot of pressure, and their families, and they were scared, and they were able to come in that way. And they also meet a need for our country. And it started in that way, where they would help to build up the labour force here. And we also had, a lot of our population migrated to New Zealand. Niueans also have New Zealand passports, so they can quite easily migrate overseas. And so it filled a need between two countries, And now that community has repopulated a village that was almost dying. There were very few people left. And now it's one of the most vibrant villages in our country with young people. And that's a really beautiful thing. So they've added a fantastic value to the community. That said, that it has not been easy. They come with different practices of gathering resources, different fishing styles, and our fishermen and fisher folk are very, I'm not sure the English word for this, they're very protective about their patch of ocean and the way that it's fished, the way that it's let to rejuvenate. And when someone comes in with a different fishing practice that's not akin to theirs, there is conflict, and there has been conflict. And this is where I go back to needing the complementary legal protection, because even though they're allowed in a different way through immigration policies, they do not have a specific separate protection that allows them privileges beyond any other visitor to the country until they become, permanent residents, etc. So if they were to get into a fight over a resource issue like that, they are quite exposed then to being deported back out of the country. And so there has been a lot of reconciliation and approaches in the community to build an understanding of both cultures and an appreciation. And so they are invited to perform their Tuvaluan cultural practice, and we celebrate that as part of our community now. So it has been a full embracing led by the village that they have come into and the surrounding ones. And now it's part of, a beautiful part of the diversity of our culture.
Thank you very much, Coral. And I'm going to pass over to you, Kate, if there's anything there that you would like to comment on. And also, Kate, I'd like to draw your attention to the question from Volker. I'm sorry, Volker, I have one eye on the clock, as always. And so I'm going to put your question to Kate, which is an appreciation for your diagram of adaptive peacebuilding strategies. And where do the relations and interactions with extra-community external actors come in, who can have considerable influence on the local context, government donors, international organizations, and so on. So evidently, we're not asking you to redraw your diagram live, but if you could speak to Volker's point in your response, that would be great. Thank you very much, Kate.
Yeah, I will speak to that. I don't know if you want me to try and answer the question around the free, prior and informed consent around relocation first. What I would say is I don't have a concrete answer to that, but it really is so diverse across the region in terms of how migration happens, how these things are negotiated, whether they're negotiated within legal frameworks, whether they're negotiated with the outside. We have seen some cases in Fiji where the benchmarks have been moved on communities. So that free, prior and informed consent, which is a very Western way of thinking about how mediation might work and may not map perfectly on in the first place, then got moved sort of during the process. And that's something we need to keep an eye on. And just thinking about the process of peace is not a final outcome. It is something that is renegotiated and imperfect, and it sits on a spectrum. So if you take some of the cases of migration around people moving from artificial islands, which are islands that have been built into lagoons, to the mainland, these are cases of ongoing negotiation. These relationships continually are negotiated between, and really where the conflict comes up is in relation to what Coral was sort of saying around differences in practices around fishing and around gardening, food gardens. So it's a really, really complex question that you asked. In relation to Volker, I think it really comes in probably at all stages, and the relational mapping, it's not just a mapping that occurs between within a community, but also looking at all the actors and, engaging with other development and climate change adaptation programs. Part of that, it's a two-way dialogue process between the project team and communities themselves, understanding, where different institutions and actors are sitting at, and really and then as part of those peace building actions, building strategic relationships, not just within communities, but also with relevant actors outside. But I think that approach really recognises where power and legitimacy lies, which is really within place-based systems of governance.
Thank you very much, Kate. And Kevin, then I'd like to turn to you to, if you have something to add on any of the questions that have been posed. Now, with an eye again on the clock, sadly, while Kevin is speaking, I'm going to close the list, and then we'll see how we can manage the outstanding questions. And then I will come back to the panel to give some final thoughts, either in response to questions or comments that have been made, or indeed anything else actually that you would like to say during this meeting. And then I would like to turn to our partner Adelphi for a couple of closing words. So, so Kevin, over to you.
Sure, thank you. I'm just looking at Sophie's question here and a bit more about different types of conflict that communities in the Pacific are facing. And so I guess, I'm just going to talk from my personal experience. And back in 1998, 99, and 2000, I lived in a rural village in Samoa. And I saw, the traditional systems and how they mediated conflict. And for instance, there was a theft. And so, the person who stole the items was not directly punished, but it was the matai, who was the head of the family, who was punished on behalf of the family and the unit. And so it was a social structure that it wasn't you individually stealing something. It was your group, your clan, your part of your village that you were part, your family. So there was these certain social constructs there that really was the way they balanced, and resolve conflict. And it makes me think about, the pressures that are being put on communities. And actually right now, in a way, COVID-19, I'm looking at it and seeing the socioeconomic pressures being put on people now, and the strain that's going to be putting on these traditional systems, but also it's the strength of these traditional systems to be able to use and tap into those to mediate any negative effects. But this is really, to me, just a taste of what we're going to face when resource scarcity will increase, with numbers like Coral mentioned earlier, 90% of the coral reefs suffering in our lifetime. That's going to have a dramatic effect on the access to food resources, and then they'd be driven, could be driven to other means coping with these negative effects of climate change. So I guess I just wanted to bring the example about that. I think every community, the Pacific is so diverse. If there's one thing people who haven't been to the Pacific is to understand, the diversity is immense. Cultural practices vary from village to village, country to country. It's quite diverse, and there are embedded practices that are practiced to this day in terms of that. One other point I wanted to share, maybe while I have the floor, is movement of people around the Pacific has been happening for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And there are amazing case studies of a variety of communities relocating, moving. And so I think, we really also need to recognize there's a really long history of this. We have, in Samoa, there was a volcanic eruption in 1905, and there was a community that moved to the other island. Yet culturally, they still maintain the tie to the original island they were from. In Fiji, you have Rambi, where you have people who are coming from Kiribati here to Fiji. So we have a lot of various experiences that are, very deep, and we can really learn from and understand and listen to, that I think can give us a clue on how to deal with these issues moving forward. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin, and thank you also for taking Sophie's question, which was the outstanding question on my list. Now, I see also there is a question from the European External Action Service from Mariko Peters around Sahara and the Pacific, which we have touched on briefly. I'm going to take bit of a punt, unless any of the three panelists would like to speak to this. I suggest that this is an extremely interesting area for investigation, but possibly not in this particular meeting. And we might think about this for future dialogues. However, if any of the three of you panelists would like to address the question of similarities and differences between the Sahara and the Pacific, bearing in mind that we didn't prep you for that question, and it is a very big question, please feel free to do so. But otherwise, Mariko and also CMI, please hear that your question's been heard, and we will think about how to address that in perhaps a different setup. So we are sadly coming towards the end of our time. I think that the questions pretty much as have been posed in the chat function have been addressed insofar as we can address these huge questions in this very short period of time. But I would like to turn back to our panel. We will go in reverse order. So we'll start with Kevin, then move to Kate, and then Coral. And I would like, if there is anything outstanding here that you would like to address, please do. I think one of the things that has struck me very much, both from your presentations but also from the discussion that's followed, is really, we talk about it a lot in peace building, but I think the emphasis here, perhaps even more so than in other places, on the importance of all responses being grounded, all knowledge being grounded in indigenous practice and indigenous knowledge, and using and having communities shape responses from that knowledge has been very important. And then the question becomes then, what if this is also very much the space for you to make very clear recommendations to external actors, NGOs, European Union, donors, whoever you wish, what should be done to support exactly this kind of very grounded indigenous response to both climate change and to the risk of violent conflict, and the risk of violent conflict in adapting to climate change. So with that, I'd like to pass over to Kevin for a couple of minutes each, and then I will pass to my colleague, Dr. Beatrice Mosel from the Adelphi Institute. So Kevin, over to you.
Great, thank you, and very happy to share a few thoughts on this question that you have here. I think one of them here is, you know, it's Pacific has been a leader in so many ways, and I think as the Pacific leadership, we need to be listening carefully to that, and we need to be hearing what the real issues are. And like Coral mentioned, the Pacific leaders have been going to the COP every year. And they're saying the story again. They're saying, hey, look, this is what's happening. And so I think listening closely to the leaders, looking carefully at the leaders' declarations, you're going to see these key issues that are arising and rising over and over again for more than a decade, decades actually. The Pacific's been bringing these issues to the international fora since the late 1980s, as far as I understand. So I think, first of all, is listening to the Pacific leaders. I think that's just so important, because it's funny, you know, I've at times been asked advice to give to some of the Pacific leaders, and in essence, they're all a lot of them are climate change experts themselves. So it's a bit funny to come in and try to advise them when they know it, they live it, they breathe it. So I think that that would be my number one recommendation. The second thing, maybe to complement that, is the financing side of things. And I think this goes back to a bit of what Coral was saying about the projectized approach. The Pacific certainly suffers from that, and I think that's a really important message. I think being able to support things in a more programmatic or holistic way would break down some of the already, you know, in a country, you know, Niue with Coral, you know, the population is quite small. And so, you know, if you have 15 donors and 20 agencies and then 30 implementing partners all coming into the same ministry and talking to them about, let's do a climate change project, you know, there's just no way to deal with it in that magnitude. It has to be sort of streamlined, coordinated, focused. And I guess I would just, in that essence, I'd highlight a very unique tool and mechanism we have in the Pacific. It's called the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, or the FRDP. And this framework, you'll notice no other place in the world really has this, where you have a regional framework that focuses on climate change and disaster risk reduction and disaster management, and wrapping that all into the development of the region. And what I really see, the reason why that came out, and one of the key reasons why it exists, is because the coordination and the working together and the coherence is so critical with small government ministries and limited number of people who can respond to so many, requests, as it were. And so what happens is, as that increases the number of projects, number of requests, it can get quite overwhelming. So with that, I think that would be my other point, is really looking at a more holistic approach. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And Kate, just a minute or two.
Yeah, I'll be as quick as possible. International organisations have a role in really looking to community organisations, civil society organisations and churches as part of the equation here, part of the response, and to building the relationships, playing a brokering role in building the relationships between governments, who often have little capacity to respond, and put those communities first. We also have to change this projectized approach. I can't stress that strongly enough. We cannot have 2 or 3 year project cycles. We can't follow results-based management systems where we need to have quantifiable outputs. We're going to do another resilience training with communities. We've already heard how resilient communities are after thousands of years of coping with negotiating different migrations, living through colonialism and the Second World War, to name a few major historic events. We are not doing intervention to others. We need to work with people, and that requires time, understanding different approaches, and trust. If we're going to finance people, we need to trust that they do want to be able to cope and to respond to these actions. And our bureaucracy is just such a barrier in doing that. And Conciliation Resources is at time guilty because we're beholden to our donors, and we do our best to work with our CSO partners to reduce that burden, but we can do so much more as an international community.
Thank you very much, Kate and Coral. A final sort of 2-minute thought from you.
Thanks so much, Laura and colleagues. Lucky Kate and Kevin have already done such a great job in picking up those key points. Sustainable financing is critical. Partnerships that are meaningful, long and enduring, not one-off injections on funding when people want votes to get into the Security Council or other things like that. It's not particularly helpful. Or if you want to, put the money in a bucket in the region that's already being used by people who actually are embedded there and doing that work. And Kate's mentioned a number at community level as well, and that's really critical. I love that these conversations are being created. I think that's really important. And I love that people are actually saying, what can I do? I'm one person, but I want to help, engage and help someone in the Pacific. And that's a really great thing and very encouraging for people in the region to see. And I think we've got a very advanced and established regional architecture in the Pacific that helps to direct people's interests and resources to the stakeholders that we know in country and to the right places and points of intervention in country, so that that support can get where it is needed. But it has to go through the systems that are in place to ensure that it can be, give you the biggest bang for the buck, for lack of a more sophisticated term. So thank you very much for creating the platform to engage. And I will respond to Mariko, because I think it is important, even though we come from islands surrounded by water. When I look at Africa, it's a land-rich country, it's incredible, but we we absolutely, Indigenous people and cultures and communities, in times of drought, in times of flood, in times of cyclones and others, we all have some really incredible ways of naturally dealing with those. And I think if we can capture those and share them across the world, would be surprised at how many things we actually have in common. And you know, these platforms help us to share that. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Coral. And before closing, I would like to pass over to Dr. Beatrice Mozzello from Adelphi. Beatrice.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Laura, and many thanks to Coral, Kate, and Kevin from the fascinating and really to the point presentations. I feel like I've learned a lot this morning. I found it really powerful the way you talked about some of the linkages between climate and security in the Pacific region, but more importantly, the way you focus on opportunity solutions. I was really struck by some of the comments and the questions making comparisons to the Sahara region. So maybe because that was what was going on in my mind as well while hearing the presentations. So maybe let me just quickly reflect on what we can learn from what we heard today, what we can transfer also to other regions. Well, first of all, I think nowhere like in the Pacific, when we talk about the Pacific, we are reminded of in addition to climate change adaptation, we need climate change mitigation. Now we need more ambition and action from all the players involved, governments, but also, as Coral said, the private sector that has been a bit missing from the equation to date. Kevin's presentation showed us the urgency of the problem with the maps, and nowhere is this more visible than in the Pacific. But also, I think the conversation today highlighted on the adaptation side, how there are new solutions or old solutions that need to be looked at and focused on: blue economy, ocean protection, ecosystem-based adaptation. There are some of these solutions being used in the Pacific region as well as elsewhere, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahara region, but we need more of these, and we need them now. The key point here, I think, from this session today that I'm going to take home is the community aspirations are critical. We often forget about people, but at the end of the day, it is all about people, and it's about to bring back people, the communities, into discussion, not just as the ones that are vulnerable, that are affected by climate change and conflict, but as being the ones with the answers to climate change and to conflict, to the challenges that we're seeing in this fora. And as Kevin said, communities are extremely diverse. So keeping that diversity between communities, but also within communities in mind, not just involving the leaders, but being able to involve and hear the voices, as Coral said, of the moms that are worrying about how they will feed their kids as a natural resource base is shrinking. And of course, the point about traditional knowledge that in some cases can be more relevant than science, to capture some of the realities that are going on the ground where science cannot reach and needs to be given credibility, needs to be used in decision making and to inform investments. Importance at the same time, scientific data. I think Kevin's point about digitalization was very important. Used to share traditional knowledge, need to connect the two dots, as Kevin said. And finally, the very important point of being able to better integrate peace building and climate change adaptation. Kate spoke about adaptive peace building practices that they are implementing with their organization. The new project launched in the Pacific by the Peace Building Commission that Kevin presented are great steps in this direction. And I think particularly in the African continent, we're seeing many more of these integrated approaches being tried out. And these are key. It's key to go beyond the short-term time-bound micro-projects, as Kate really stressed, focusing on long-term investments that prioritize actions that achieve simultaneously climate change adaptation, peace building, and sustainable development.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Beatrice. And it just falls to me to thank our three extraordinary panelists. Thank you very much for making the time to share your insights with us today and to kick off this discussion. This is a discussion that hasn't ended, and I look forward to continuing it. And indeed, the next of these workshops is exactly 1 week from today, although the time is not the same, on Thursday, the 1st of October. And we have talked about Africa. We have talked about the importance of video. And next week we have a video, Marsabit, the first documentary screening and interactive discussion on natural resource management and responding in a conflict-sensitive manner to the diverse impacts of climate change on food security and livelihoods in Kenya. And our speakers will be Vincent Omunyan from World Vision Kenya and Simone Di Vincenza from Christian Aid. So we very much hope you will be able to join us for this. The third session, the information is in the invitation that you received for this workshop. If you have any questions, please contact my colleague Lorenzo Angelini, who invited you to this. I would like to thank Lorenzo for everything he has done in bringing us all together today. I'd like to thank adelphi and of course the German Federal Foreign Ministry. And all that remains for me to do is to say thank you all, and let's continue this discussion, what Coral was saying about the importance of discussion and dialogue. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Goodbye.